Eddie Howe's admitted it's been a very frustrating summer so far for Newcastle United on the transfer front, and that defeat to Celtic on Saturday will not have helped at all. Alexander Isak was sent home from the game, which only fuels speculation further on his future. We'll get into all of that and discuss Newcastle's overall transfer strategy with only weeks to go until that crucial first game of the season against Aston Villa. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Before we start, please do subscribe and hit like on this video. It really helps. Join the community. There's lots to talk about, but today's video may not be the most upbeat because we've got a disastrous weekend to sort of unpack, I think, off the back of what was a very difficult week, and Newcastle are facing some tough questions over their direction of travel between now and the Aston Villa game, as I said in the intro. But before we get going, a little bit of housekeeping. Can you let me know in the comment section what you want to see from this channel going forward into the next season? I plan in increments on how I do things, and I've not really looked beyond the summer yet. And I really enjoy doing daily content, daily transfer videos, lots of views, lots of comments, people getting involved. I really appreciate that. But I'd be interested to know what you want to see beyond the transfer window into next season. We want to see daily content continued. This is your opportunity to influence what happens on this channel. I really appreciate anybody who does get back to me with some suggestions, because I just want to understand what will work next season when perhaps the news is slowing down a little bit and things settle into the new season. What do you want to see next season? There'll be plenty of matches, hopefully, most home games, hopefully plenty of away ones as well, in the Champions League as well. What sort of content do you want to see on the channel? I'm really hoping to use the momentum I've built this summer to really build this into something and really base my whole career off. That's really the plan, and I want you guys to help me shape that. So let me know what you think in the comment section. Today we're really going to break down what was a very poor weekend off the back of a difficult week. So we know the whole situation with Alexander Isak's future. Liverpool had made a move, then they moved on to Hugo Ekitike. Newcastle have been rejected by Ekitike in the process, and there's other moves that are going on as well in the background. There's another potential rejection which we'll talk about in a bit as well, and that leads on to bigger, more serious questions about the transfer strategy, which we will talk about. But I think we do have to focus on Alexander Isak picking up from Saturday at Celtic and the fallout from that before talking about general frustration. There's lots of negativity that's emanated from Glasgow, really, and it's not a new story, really. I mean, I was at Hull last season and there was a negative feeling around that, even though it was a good win that day. There was lots of transfer questions. Paul Mitchell had just come in. There was the England job floating around for Eddie Howe. His future was very much up in the air, and his comments in the media were taken to inflame situations. And I think that's exactly what's happened again in a very different way. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. I have written a piece on this as well, explaining that for Forbes, which I'll link in the description. But the game itself was a disaster. I don't tend to think too much about pre-season friendlies. It's mainly about fitness, and you've got to give the context that Celtic are 3 weeks ahead of Newcastle in their development. Newcastle have really just upped it in Austria, which is why Isak wasn't really involved. Obviously, he's still nursing that groin problem. Joelinton had a knee injury that's kept him out the end of last season, so he wasn't involved as well. Minutes are being managed, things are being dealt with before the Asia tour, but that was all secondary, and the result, no one has really talked about the result. I mean, Nick Pope made a pretty bad error, which created this sort of whole thing around the goalkeeper situation. Again, we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later in the show. But it all seems to be a story once the questions about Alexander Isak started to come. And the big thing that Eddie Howe chose to do was to send Isak home and keep Joelinton in the stands. And I understand his logic in some ways to send him home 10% because of the speculation, is what he said. The minutes managed thing was the thing that the club said before the game. After the game, it became a little bit murky. And I understand the thought process behind it, but the actions of what he did, Eddie Howe, in sending Isak home, I mean, maybe it was a lose-lose situation, but it only inflamed the situation. I mean, I had to write an article on it that evening. It was on Sky Sports News. The Liverpool fans loved it and got back involved in the whole discourse, which has really fueled the whole thing over the last week. I mean, ultimately, if Liverpool fans weren't on social media, or anyone wasn't on social media, the story would have been purely that they'd made an inquiry, had been rejected, Isak had trained, and then probably he sat in the stands at Celtic without any reason not to, and Liverpool obviously in the middle of that moved on to Ekitike. What's happened now is that it's a conversation that we're even having to talk about 2 days on, and it's still bubbling away. It's only inflamed the situation. I think what he should have done ultimately is sent both Isak and Joe Linton home, because there is logic to the idea that Howe had of Isak sitting in the stands, maybe the media trying to get a word with him if they could, but also just the camera panning to him. If he's already a little bit unsettled by the speculation, I mean, we're unsettled by the speculation, so God knows what it's doing to Alex himself. So I think it was well intentioned. I don't think there's anything to hide, but the fact that he did that has created this idea that something is maybe untoward, something is wrong. Add to that the talk of Saudi Arabia and Al Hilal, which has come up, and then these quotes, which I didn't really want to talk about when I sat down this morning, or planned the video yesterday. These quotes which have been attributed to his agent in Saudi Arabia, which suggests that the next stage is close. But I will touch on them in a minute, because I do have some thoughts. If they are genuine, I think it's very difficult to verify them. It really shows the problem with the modern media, which is that I think a lot of people have just run with those quotes without verifying them. That's just my opinion. But I think that's caused me to have to discuss this and give my thoughts. But yeah, I think the whole Isak situation was blown out of proportion because of the way Eddie Howe chose to deal with it. He didn't have to be so open about the speculation impacting. He did say something which is a little bit interesting, I think, on terms of having talks with Isak and understanding that the player's career is short, which I think isn't news really, because I think we've already accepted, and I've certainly said on this channel, that I think Isak is open to the idea of a move to Liverpool and open to the idea of a move in the future if it comes up. Liverpool is a very enticing opportunity to go and play for the Premier League champions. The money that he can earn at bigger clubs is a bigger thing, and obviously he's one of the best, if not the best striker in the world at the moment. He deserves to be paid like one, and so that is why there's so much speculation around Isak this summer. As I always said, the stance from Newcastle was he's not for sale, and only Isak pushing for it and making noise would make that happen. And the fact that Liverpool moved on to Ekitike, whether the Liverpool fans like it or not, shows that they have got other plans because they haven't been given the encouragement by Isak's actions. And I think that that's all still true. So there was no real need for Eddie Howe to pour fuel on the fire in the way that he did by being so open, because Newcastle have maintained the control of the Isak situation right from the very start, I think, and they've still got it. The Saudi Arabia stuff is so bizarre to me, and again, it just goes to show about the whole thing I've said previously about don't believe everything you read, because things are out there for an agenda. And I think that for me, everything is pointing towards the agents pushing stuff to try and put pressure on Newcastle to offer him a new contract. The Saudi stuff, all the rumours about Saudi Arabia, one, they don't make sense for various different reasons in terms of the ownership links. Obviously, PIF own both clubs and there are ties there. Would Isak really want to go at the peak of his powers to Saudi Arabia? Obviously, there's lots of money in there as an opportunity, but he deserves to play in the Champions League. He deserves to be challenging for the very top honours in the game, and I think Saudi Arabia wouldn't allow him to do that. And then there's these apparent quotes from Isak's agent, Gonzalo Gaitan, which emerged from a Saudi newspaper yesterday, where he basically said that something is close, but he wouldn't elaborate on whether it was a transfer or a contract. Now, if a transfer was close and Liverpool were the ones mainly the biggest threat, I think we've all agreed with that, they wouldn't surely be tying up the Ekitike deal. That's now agreed. It's pretty much going to be done in the next few days by all accounts. Surely something would have emerged in the last few days. We were told constantly last week that 24 to 48 hours was the key time frame, and nothing really happened on the Isak front. Everything happened on the Ekitike front. So to me, Liverpool have become less of a threat, as I said in last week's videos. And I do think that if these quotes are true, they are creating this bigger picture, which is that the agents trying to put pressure on Newcastle to get the best deal for Isak, and he will sign a new contract. I've said for a long time there'll probably be a release clause in there. It'll probably only keep him on better terms for next season, because even if he stays at Newcastle, he deserves a better wage packet than 120 grand a week. I know that's a hell of a lot of money. It's a hell of a lot of money for anybody, but when you are the best striker in the world, you deserve to be paid the best possible money, and Newcastle are planning to make him the highest paid player in the club's history. So I think that all points to that at the moment, that this is all pressure. This is a reason why there's so much stuff that doesn't make any logical sense out there without things actually happening, because all of it is conjecture, all of it is just speculation and noise. And it is disappointing to see that that has impacted Eddie Howe's decision, even in a small way, because I think that's the thing. The 10% quote was interesting, because the speculation being a small part of the thinking has now made it the big story again. And I think that's where Eddie Howe went wrong. But all of this noise being out there with nothing really forward happening, no noise from Isak on a transfer request, no offers being made by Liverpool or anybody else, no testing of the resolve, all of it just noise. Isak still remaining calm and open to anything just suggests to me it's all a way of his agents trying to push the situation into Isak getting the best terms, which Newcastle are open to offering. The whole situation with Isak has just been blown out of proportion, but firstly by Eddie Howe and all the noise outside. The thing I can't get my head around from Eddie Howe's perspective is he wanted to shut the noise down and he only created more. And you could say that that's a lose-lose situation. You could say that if he sat in the stands, he would have had the same level of speculation in a different way. That's why I would have sent Joe Linton home, because if you send Joe Linton home as well, he's not playing anyway. If you send the pair of them home, then the pair of them are... then the perception is that they're going home for the same reason, and it's because of managing minutes. That's an easy thing to sell when Joe Linton's doing the same thing and he's also been injured. But sending one home, keeping the other there, it just creates this whole storm, which I think has not been helpful to anybody. So despite all this, I actually come away thinking Isak's more likely to sign a new contract. The noise being so loud and being so specific. I mean, the agent, if it's true, saying that something's close, but no deal is close, talk of a new contract going on in the background as well, I think it just feels like that is the more likely course of action. The other thing that Eddie Howe spoke about on Saturday was the frustration with the transfer situation, and I've spoken right from the very start on these videos about Newcastle's transfer strategy being wrong, and there was a great piece by Luke Edwards in the Telegraph basically outlining the difficulty that Newcastle are facing, where they feel like they need to go and get plug-in and play players, as he wrote it, ready to go, able just to improve the first team immediately and take them to a new level. And the idea of signing somebody from, not necessarily abroad, because they've obviously bid for Ekitike, they've got Scalvini on their list, but the idea of taking a risk is a difficult thing. But the trouble is, and I tweeted this last week and I've written extensively about it, spoken extensively about it, that's exactly how they've done their business in the past. They've never succeeded by going for these top end players, because the other clubs that want them have more money, have more ability to sign them. So the quote again that Eddie Howe said, and it was very similar to the one that I've referenced before after Girona last season at the Celtic Cup, was that there's only a few players that can improve the team, and we're looking for a player that also wants to desperately join Newcastle, which rules out Ekitike and obviously João Pedro. As soon as another club came in, they looked elsewhere. But you're also looking for somebody who's willing to join Newcastle at a lower rate when other clubs come in and are able and willing to go further in terms of the transfer fees. Those players don't exist. There's nobody who's good enough but also so desperate to join Newcastle they would do it on a lower rate. So you have to take risks. That's the reality. And in the previous windows, Newcastle have signed players that big clubs have looked at and avoided for whatever reason, chose not to take that risk. And that comes down to Isak over Darwin Núñez. As amazing as it is, 3 years ago, all the clubs wanted strikers again. Liverpool got the pick of them because City had already tied up Haaland weeks before. The next in line was Darwin Núñez, who's done really well in the Champions League for Benfica. He played really well in Portugal as well. Bit like Gyökeres, but younger. He was the ideal player, it looked like, and lots of clubs wanted him. Liverpool won that race. Arsenal had already bought Gabriel Jesus because he knew Mikel Arteta, and it left Newcastle in the striker search looking for the one that was available. Isak was the one who was available. They've obviously come out really well from that, but it proves that that is how it works, and Newcastle are still the same place in the food chain. They still have to take those risks, and there are so many players out there who big clubs have looked at and maybe avoided for various different reasons, especially when you consider that Newcastle need a striker to play alongside Isak or behind Isak. So there isn't the pressure that they need to be ready-made in the same way that there may be at centre-back or at right midfield, where there really needs to be a first-team bona fide upgrade in those positions. Up front, there's less of that pressure, so I think that there needs to be more risks taken. I've said this so many times, this isn't new, but that's exactly why, because those players that Newcastle are attempting to sign all have bigger and better options. It's very difficult to stand out from the market when you've got that, even with a trophy, even with Champions League football. there's so much more to offer in terms of wages, history and opportunity, and the perception of those other clubs that impacts Newcastle's ability to make these signings. So they have to be more creative, and the fact that they are refusing to do that, and they've made this conscious choice by the sounds of it from Luke's piece, is worrying. They do need to go back to the drawing board, as I've said so many times. The line about Paul Mitchell leaving Eddie Howe in the lurch at the start of the window didn't help. Obviously, that there's been lots of talk of their fractured relationship and the fact that it didn't work. But just purely in terms of numbers and getting the deals done and having someone to do those negotiations, it's proven frustrating. But the frustrating thing for me with Mitchell and Howe is that there was a perfect way that they both could have got what they wanted out of this window. If Eddie Howe wants 4 or 5 players and wants mainly players that he knows will improve the squad in its 2 key positions, those first team upgrades at right hand side and centre back. But let's say, for argument's sake, he gets Alanga and Mark Gahey, and then you can tell Mitchell, whose remit is more to go and scour Europe and find these great players who in untapped markets or ways or find different ways to do things. You could tell him to go and find a striker, a centre midfielder and a goalkeeper. That would have been the way I would have done it, and that would have got the perfect balance. But that hasn't happened. Newcastle have been ambitious, they've been willing to spend big money, they've made big offers for players, and that is why it's not the same as the Mike Ashley years. That's why there's still hope, and that's why they can go into that Villa game still with the idea of having 2 or 3 upgrades rather than just Alanga on the right hand side. But there's a fundamental issue, fundamental misunderstanding with what's happened. I mean, last year they had this fruitless chase for Mark Gahey because of the price. They didn't have any other options to move on to, and that back them into a corner. It seems very similar, like they are still chasing all the players that they were chasing last time, and that can be a good thing. We've seen, we've spoken about their desire for long-term targets and the way that they go into scouting, and their recruitment is really good in terms of identifying players, but they need to do that more and find other players that are more available. We've spoken so many times about strikers, Samu, Pavlidis, Sesko the other week, so many centre-backs as well. And these are various different price ranges as well that we've spoken about as players who are options, who've got decent underlying stats, who've done really well in the Champions League, in their other leagues as well. There's an element of risk, but that's what you have to do with the price that Newcastle can pay for players, and also the fact that other clubs are ready and willing to pay better money, better wages, and also, perhaps the London thing as well is a factor. I think less about that. I think it's more about the opportunity, and you have to create an idea, as they did with Isak, as they did with Tonali, as they did with Botman, that there's something to build at Newcastle, and they're still at that stage. Even though they've got into the Champions League, even though they've ended their trophy drought, there's still so much to go on. And the James Trafford situation is really interesting because he's kind of gone from sort of player that they would have ordinarily signed. What Newcastle have previously done is gone for players that big clubs have looked at and chosen not to sign, or clubs or players from relegated clubs, or also development players like Tino Livramento or Will Asula or Lewis Hall, Nick Pope from Burnley, Harvey Barnes from Leicester. Those deals could still be done, but they're opting not to do them. James Trafford felt like that sort of signing until last week, when Manchester City have apparently come to the table. They've got a buyback clause for 40 million they don't want to pay. Burnley do seem to be pushing the price up as well. That's why this deal hasn't moved on. But Newcastle have kind of got a difficult situation where they have to go up against Man City again, and that one could be difficult. Obviously Edison still has to go, and there's Galatasaray, and Ortega could leave. There's this whole situation with Man City and the goalkeeping situation that needs to be sorted. The reason is he isn't a priority. They're looking at strikers, they're looking at centre-backs as well, and Newcastle are being quite slow because of the lack of staff that they've got in place, and they're having to go almost one deal at a time, which is all very difficult. It all creates this idea that Newcastle haven't learned from their mistakes, and we've said that before. It's a little bit of a mess, and the whole Isak situation is bubbling alongside this, and it can't be impressing him and his agent that all this is going on while he has been denied the opportunity to maybe go and better himself at a different club. That's just the way you've got to look at it. But he's not kicking up a fuss, and I think he is keen to stay for at least one more year on better terms. That's why I'm getting a greater sense that all of this noise is geared towards that rather than Isak leaving. He will be on the plane to Asia, which is great. But Newcastle do need to get a different approach to the transfer window, as I've said so many times, and I've explained again on this video. Write a piece for Forbes as well on this afternoon, so do read that. The piece on Saturday with my thoughts on Eddie Howe's comments about Isak is down in the description. Also, please do let me know what sort of content you want to see next season, because I'm starting to think about how I approach this from September onwards. I'll be back tomorrow with yet another one, and I'll see you then. Cheers.